or So hello and welcome to all to this webinar on health and indigenous people policy at the experiences with Mapuche communities, which is hosted by APA Division 52 International Psychology. This webinar is part of the series titled Vision from the Global South to celebrate the activities of psychologists that live in the Global South, to provide useful information for international engagement and to encourage us to take a broader global perspective. The webinar series has been founded by the Interdivisional Grant Culturally Competent Counseling Vision from the Global South in partnership with the Division 17 Counseling Psychology. My name is Pina Marsico and I am the president of Division 52 and your host for today's webinar. I want to thank the members of the webinar committee, Dr. Tio Lazarus, the chair, Dr. Tatiana Elcour and Raffaele Modugno. Before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask questions by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. So please feel free to type your questions during the presentation, and Tatiana will be making note of them, organizing them, and during the last 10 minutes, she will present them to our speaker for discussion. At this time, I will introduce and welcome our guest speaker. Camila Pérez is an indigenous researcher based in southern Chile. As a member of the Mapuche people, she has participated in the special program of health and indigenous people, which constitutes the practical dimension of the Chilean policy of health and indigenous people. Her research has explored the implementation of this program in rural Mapuche communities, considering both the cultural and the institutional aspects of this process. Recently, she has addressed the notion of kume mongen, or good living, from the Mapuche perspective and the challenges faced by indigenous people in colonial settings to live accordingly to cultural principles of well-being. So please, Camila, thanks for it's over you now. Thanks for being part of today's webinar.
Thank you, Pina. First, I would like to thank to the organization of this session, APA Division 52 International Psychology and Division 17 Society of Counseling Psychology. My presentation today aims to identify the core elements of the Chilean health and indigenous peoples policy through the specific experience with Mapuche communities, and to introduce the Mapuche notion and health and well-being, and finally to understand some results and challenges of the implementation of this policy in Mapuche communities. Are you seeing my second slide? Okay, thank you. Well, the policy is a very complex word. Before to introduce the core elements of this Chilean health and indigenous peoples policy, I would like to provide you some context to understand the reality of indigenous peoples in general and of the Mapuche people particularly. As you said, Pina, I am an indigenous researcher, member of the Mapuche people, so my presentation in this webinar reunites both my academic work and also my personal experience in the world of intercultural health. When I proposed this research to the psychology department in my university, it was not very common to address cultural or indigenous issues in psychological studies. These topics are still considered more related to other social sciences like anthropology. And besides, it was really challenging to build my research project as the sociocultural dimension of health was not part of my training plan as a student. However, I have been supported by other researchers, both in psychology and from other disciplines. And I have been able to develop some ideas regarding the cultural understanding of well-being and to contribute with some little reflections on intercultural health practices, which is what I'm going to share with you in this webinar with focus on the experience of the Mapuche people. Well, the ancestral lands of the Mapuche people are in southern Latin America, both in Chile and Argentina. My work has to do specifically with the situation in Chile, where the Mapuche people represent almost 80% of the indigenous population among 9 indigenous peoples that are recognized by law, as you can see in this chart. The Aymara, Licanantai, Quechua, Coya, and the Ayita communities live in northern Chile. Some of them live in the border that connects Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. Rapa Nui people is in the popular eastern island, and the Cahuéscar and Yagan communities are located in the extreme south of Chile or Patagonia. All of these indigenous peoples that you see in this chart are included in programs of intercultural health under the umbrella of the Health and Indigenous Peoples Policy. An extremely interesting question to me is how the personal experience of being indigenous connects with the realm of public policies. I, from my experience, identify at least 3 dimensions in the process of recognition of your indigenous roots from the personal to the social or institutional level. In the first place is the self-identification when you recognize your indigenous heritage. Self-identification is both a social and a personal process. You can recognize your identity as an individual in your family space, with your relatives or your community. But it is important to know or to emphasize that there is a lot of discrimination against indigenous people. Indigenous peoples are the most discriminated group in Chile, so the decision about the expression of your indigenous identity is a day-by-day negotiation. And then in the second level, in the public sphere, the indigenous identity is consulted through some national measurements, such as the census. There are some institutions, such as a school, that ask to the families whether they identify or not as a member of one of the indigenous peoples in Chile. In both instances, you are free to declare or not declare that information. This information is required just for statistical purposes sometimes, without direct implications for your life. And then is the official registration, the more formal via to be officially recognized as an indigenous person. And through this process, you have to provide your family information to the National Corporation of Indigenous Peoples to demonstrate that beyond self-identification, you really have indigenous roots. Through this process, you obtain an official document where the state certificates that you belong to one of the indigenous peoples recognized by law. Here in this picture, you can see my own document. This is a real document. I completed this process when I was at primary school to apply to a special program of grants for indigenous students. This document, this certification is required by national offices or institutions. Every time you have to you have to prove your indigeneity, and it allows you to participate in social spaces such as indigenous communities, in rural areas, indigenous associations in urban areas, and in special programs for indigenous peoples in culture, education, or health, which is the topic of this webinar. Okay. Now I will introduce some of the critical elements of the health and indigenous peoples policy. During my adolescence, I joined to an indigenous association in my city, and we as a group were invited by the community health office to participate in some actions to revitalize indigenous medicine as part of the programmatic line descending from the policy, including encounters with indigenous healers, guided visits to ecocultural places, and other kind of cultural activities. So first, I was a user of this special program for more than a decade. And then when I was doing my master's degree in health psychology, I was able to recognize and value this policy as an experience of inclusion, of cultural beliefs and cultural practice on health within the therapeutic process of indigenous people. So I decided to address this experience as part of my research, and that was my journey to the work that I am sharing with you today. In my opinion, some historical context is necessary to understand the root of this public policy, which are very complex. The 90s was a critical decade for indigenous peoples in the Americas, as multiple historical and political decisions coincided and affected the lives of indigenous communities. At the international level, in 1992, the fifth centennial of the colonization of the Americas was commemorated, which renewed the discussion on the living conditions and the oppression faced by indigenous communities in the Americas. In the specific area of health, the Pan American Organization was part of a relevant declaration known as the Fifth Resolution on Indigenous Peoples that encourage member states to implement actions in favor of indigenous peoples. And during the same year, the Mapuche program, known as PROMAP, as you can see in this map, was officially recognized. The PROMAP was first an informal initiative led by physicians and health teams in general from services located in rural areas with a large percentage of indigenous users. And the main purpose of PROMAP was to include cultural health practices and recognize the role of indigenous healers in the therapeutic process. This program is the basis of the foreign public policy of health and indigenous people. And a year later, the indigenous law was enacted in Chile after 3 decades of dictatorship, in which there was no dialogue between the state and indigenous peoples. This law promoted the protection and development of indigenous peoples and facilitated the consolidation of initiatives such as the PROMAP. Later, with dialogue between the Ministry of Health and indigenous communities, PROMAP underwent some modifications and was called PESPI, which stands for a Special Program for Health and Indigenous Peoples, which is now applicable to the 9 indigenous peoples recognized by law until 2003, when this program escalated to a public policy. Well, this process took 3 years of work, of dialogue between the ministry and indigenous communities, with a lot of tensions in the middle. This is the cover in the picture of the official document that was finally published and distributed nationwide in 2006. The objective of the Health and Indigenous Peoples Policy is to improve the health situation of Indigenous peoples through the development of an intercultural health model under principles of equity and participations of Indigenous communities and Indigenous authorities. Now, how does the policy works in real life? For sure, one of the main challenges is how to implement this policy, this particular policy for a particular group within a complex system dealing with multiple demands. This is a map of all the Ministry of Health departments. For this webinar, I have prepared a simplified version of this map just to illustrate how the national level dialogues with the community level. At the national level, a very positive element favored by the policy is the presence or the participation of indigenous advisors who guide the decisions of the Ministry of Health. And additionally, a research and studies department provides systematic information on the course of policy. Beyond this specific research and studies department, depending on the ministry, universities plays a very important role. There are some public universities working directly with the ministry, as well as numerous researchers, which is my case, whose production contributes to the evaluation and improvement of public policy. And at the local level, in the local health department, the Health and Indigenous Peoples Manager is also an Indigenous person who coordinates the interchange of resources and information between the national and local level. And naturally, it is at the community level where the public policy takes place. Each service, including hospitals and family health centers, have a health and indigenous peoples coordinator whose role is technical and administrative. And a key actor, in my opinion, the more relevant actor of this policy is the intercultural facilitator, who is an indigenous person who is able to speak the native language and has a deep understanding of the indigenous health system. Both the Health and Indigenous Peoples Coordinator and the Intercultural Facilitator work very closely with the communities and coordinate the participation of communities, indigenous associations, and also the participation of indigenous healers in the therapeutic process. Here you can see some recent news showing some actions within the special program on health and indigenous peoples in partnership with some public universities. This news announces the elaboration of a document with guidelines to implement and improve the public policy. And in this second news, there is a public research center that organized a visit to health services with vast experience in intercultural health with Mapuche communities in partnership with the Public Service of Health. Now, having clarified the general structure of the public policy, I would like to emphasize just some elements of the cultural understanding of health from the perspective of the Mapuche people. Please pay attention to the concept of kumemungen. Kumemungen is the native concept which has been translated into Spanish as buen vivir or buena vida, and which in psychology could be understood as well-being, as the concept of well-being. From the Mapuche culture, Kumemungen depends on a respectful coexistence between human beings and nature, including and recognizing the spiritual dimension of life. One of the weaknesses of the policy of health and indigenous peoples has to do precisely with the disconnection regarding environmental conflicts, disrupting ecocultural places located in the ancestral lands of the Mapuche people, such as the one you can see in this picture, and which fortunately is within a protected area. From the Mapuche perspective, illness is understood as a consequence of disruption. The native concept that refers to illness is Mapuche Kutran, and in the Mapuche categorization of illnesses, in addition to the physical and psychological dimension, social and spiritual illnesses are included. Disruption here is understood as any action that harms other people within the community or that alters the balance of nature. So it is impossible for the Mapuche people to talk about health and illness without considering the environment. This weakness regarding the disconnection between the policy and the disruption of the environment can be the starting point to discuss some challenges and future directions for health policy and indigenous peoples. From the beginning of this political process and cultural process, this policy was conceived as a work in progress, as it requires continuous dialogue between the Ministry of Health and indigenous communities, as well as the collaboration of academia. So far, its main contributions are the promotion of indigenous medicines, the improvement of quality and sensibility, cultural sensibility of services, especially of those located in indigenous territories, and the construction or the development of an intercultural health model. In this picture, you can see one of the most important intercultural hospitals in Chile. Intercultural hospitals are managed with the participation of indigenous communities. The Mapuche people counts with 3 important intercultural hospitals in southern Chile. I conducted part of my research in one of them. And it is here where the most of the intercultural health model is developed. Now, regarding future directions, there has been renewed attention now to the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, particularly in the context of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. In my opinion, this approach could enrich public policy as it promotes the health of communities in connection with the rights to adequate food, adequate housing, adequate education, and the right to enjoy a cultural life. And obviously, this approach can also encourage the articulation between different policies and different institutions. One of the questions around the health policy and indigenous peoples is whether health centers are able of solving socio-cultural needs. And experience has shown that this type of needs demand the collaboration of multiple actors and multiple institutions. Undoubtedly, researchers and universities are one of these actors, as we are able to design pilot programs and eventually evaluate their effects as an input for the future of this policy. Here are some of my references in honor of time, my presentation. And here there are many other points to discuss about health policy and indigenous peoples. I hope you are interested in learning more about this topic. Respectfully, I would like to recommend two Mapuche authors. The first one is Jose Guibel. In his book, The Mapuche Notion of Persona, you can find more information about the Mapuche understanding of health in general. And finally, I would like to recommend the author Elisa Loncón Antileo. She is an important researcher, Mapuche researcher, who has collaborated in the revitalization of the native Mapuche language, whose practice in schools was forbidden by law until 1992. This book is titled Trayenco, which means waterfall, and tells the experience of a Mapuche woman in academic and political spaces. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks again to the organization of this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Perez. This has been a wonderful presentation and very insightful perspectives. We do have several questions coming in, so we'd like to invite everybody to use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and we'll be happy to have them be posed for Dr. Perez to answer. So the first question is, Anna would like to know whether the indigenous people in Chile are only self-declared or if there is any identification process based on phenotypic traits such as skin color.
Yes, thank you for that question. We have an official process to recognize in front of the institutions your indigeneity, especially in the light of this kind of policies. You can apply as an indigenous person for grants, or you can participate of these programs once you provide your family information in front of the National Corporation of Indigenous Peoples. They revise your family information, and then they give you an official document that you have to present in front of the institutions every time you want to participate. So the first stage is the self-identification, but then you have to dialogue with the state.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great, thank you very much. Okay, there are two other questions. Now, the first question is, you've mentioned the cross-sectoral nature of working in policy, but particularly tailored to the health and indigenous people in Chile. So, and you've also mentioned that the university plays a key role. Can you give some guidance on how the university managed the power dynamics between sectors and how it brought all sectors together for a one outcome, basically a focus on health and indigenous people?
Yes, public universities in Chile plays a key role. Usually, public policy is not accompanied by enough resources to cover the evaluation process of the policy itself. So universities may participate in this work of evaluation of the policy, and regarding the power dynamics. In my opinion, the presence of indigenous researchers helps to balance the power relationship between the academia as a place of power and the state, because in this scenario you have a complex interaction among the state, the universities, and indigenous communities, which are usually the less advantaged group in this dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Great. And the other question is, if you are to give 3 pieces of advice for international psychologists working with indigenous people, what would your 3 pieces of advice be?
That's a difficult question. But the first one for sure is that culture and health are indivisible. You, as a psychologist, should not think about well-being without considering culture. We all have a culture. Maybe in the case of indigenous peoples, culture becomes more visible or relevant, but we all have some cultural beliefs and cultural practices about our processes of health and illnesses. So my advice is also to put on the table the cultural dimension. That's the first one.
Great. Yeah. Dr. Pina, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great presentation. And I have a very specific curiosity on the basis of my little knowledge of Maputo complex systems of beliefs. I got a lot of, the notion of Kume Mongen as it's got a lot of attention to me. And I would like to know, Camila, if you are fine with both the Spanish translation, Buen Vivir, Buena Vida, and the English translation of well-being, if those translations in Spanish and English, they really capture the complexity of the notion of Kume Mongen, or there is something left, there is something that is not included in this translation. as this circulating nowadays in contemporary environmental psychology or no perspective?
Thank you, Pina. Here, as you said, the Kyume is a key concept within the cultural perspective of life of the Mapuche people. And this is a very common concept within other indigenous communities in the Americas. So the translation of Buen Vivir is the most close translation to cover the concept in all the American indigenous communities. And obviously there is a gap, a cultural gap, especially with the concept of well-being. When you revised our understanding or our definitions of well-being in psychology, you can note the individualistic approach, sometimes the definition or those measurements that we apply to measure well-being are so different from the personal understanding of well-being. So in my opinion, the principal gap is composed for the lack of attention to the cultural dimension of well-being, the community dimension of well-being, and the spiritual dimension of well-being, which is very specific in every indigenous people.
Thank you very much.
Great. We do have another question. We hear of many Mapuche communities defending woods and rivers to protect the environment and the health of their communities. Is this more legitimated, or are there still many Mapuche people in jail or under accused for defending the environment?
Yes, the situation is extremely complex. In Chile, there is a special law to criminalize people participating in environmental fights. And after the analysis of the effects of this law, the results show that the Mapuche leaders are one of the groups more affected by this law. In southern Chile, in rural areas, there are many ecocultural places affected by industrial projects interested in natural resources, and the communities, the indigenous communities around, many times activate collective actions to stop these projects, but the consequence is very severe. We have had some Mapuche leaders in jail, in fact.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think another question relates more to resources. So you've mentioned that it's critical to build a cultural understanding of health if we're working with indigenous people. So are there particular resources that you think a psychologist should refer to and should work on or study more from if they want to work with Mapuche communities?
One important thing is to consider that today most of the Mapuche people is living outside ancestral territories and outside their ancestral communities. So when you imagine the notion of well-being from the perspective of the Mapuche people, you can also make the effort to imagine the reality of indigenous people in this post-colonial scenario, living in cities or living without their family. So to me, as a psychologist, one permanent question and challenge is how to enjoy cultural life or Kyumemongen under these conditions. So, from my perspective, psychologists working in this topic should be interested in searching for ways to build community beyond ancestral land and to build conditions or recover conditions for Kyumemongen or well-being in colonial scenarios.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any further questions, so I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Pina.
I just want to thank Camila. I have several more other questions, but maybe this might be for another time, another moment. We are, let's say, we need sometimes to think upon all of the things you have brought to us today, especially this idea of spiritual component in well-being, which is, I think, an extremely peculiar for the global South way of thinking of healing and caring of other people and of the nature. Thanks a lot. I really, once again, thank you, Camila Pérez, and for what you are doing. You are very, let's say, humble to promote or to suggest some more literature from other colleagues. But I really want instead invite all our audience to search for Camila Pérez literature, which is extremely provocative, thought-provocative, innovative. And that thanks a lot for being with us today to bring this kind of general understanding of political issue when it comes to Mapuche people. I let's say turn to you, Tatiana, for the final conclusion. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been really a great webinar, and we'd like to invite everyone to join our webinar series, for which we will continue to speak more about the Kyumemongen and Buen Vivir in November. So our next webinar will be on November 15. It's at 10:30 Eastern Time. So please log in on division52.net/webinars. So it's div52/webinars. And register for the upcoming webinars, and we look forward to having you all participate in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.